Hello, and welcome to the Explain Scenery Development video series. My name is Matt Congrove. I'm the founder of Airport Tech, which is an Explain Scenery Development design studio. You can catch me regularly on Twitch TV, where I will be streaming scenery development and design and answering any questions you all may have regarding these topics. In today's video, we'll be going over texturing basics for Sketchup. I should point out first that we will be using Sketchup 2016, not the latest version, which is Sketchup 2017, so things may be slightly different depending on when you're watching this video and what version of Sketchup you're using. Before we start texturing the objects in Sketchup though, we first have to create the texture image file. Now, Explain gives us a few rules when we're doing this, and one of the most important ones is that the image dimensions must be in what we call power of 2. Here's a nice little chart to help you visualize that, but an easy way to think of it is your hard drive size or the amount of RAM that you have in your computer. You're talking 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, and on and on. There is an upper limit of this though. Explain can only handle image dimensions that are 4096 pixels wide or high and lower. Now, they don't have to match up exactly. You don't have to create a square. You can have one side that, for instance, is 512, and the other side may be 4096 pixels. So you can have rectangles, you can have a square. It's your choice, but you still have to use the power of 2, and you have the maximum of 4096. Now, another limitation that we have is that we can only use one texture file per object. So you can't have if you have a roof texture and a wall texture and a window texture, these all have to be crammed into one image that we will use inside of our object. You can't have 3 separate images. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about how we're going to work to use those materials to create that one image and pull that in then to SketchUp and start the texturing process. Before we start trying to place some materials into the texture image, of course, we first have to determine what materials we're going to use. So at this time, I'll show you the object that we're going to be using for today's video. This is an office building, and it's a fairly typical office building. It has some glass walls on the side, and it will have some bitumen along the roof. Now, because we're keeping it simple, that's all we need, but most likely if you were doing a model for Explain, it's going to be a bit more complex than that. So it's important, very, very important that at the beginning, as soon as you're done with the model and as soon as you're about ready to start texturing it, you need to determine all the materials, or at least most of the materials that you think that you're going to need to get the job done. And we'll talk about why that's important a little bit later. But for now, let's talk about where are we going to get the images for these different materials. And my favorite, personally, is a website called textures.com. They have tons of options. All this stuff is free. And if we go into the roofing section, for instance, we can see that they have bitumen. And we can click on that, and there's all sorts of different options. There's a handy little link over here that says Show Seamless Textures Only, and I try to always use a seamless texture. That way I can use it and tile it, essentially, so it's repetitive that way. So we'll go ahead and click that, and this one right here looks pretty good. So I'm going to go grab some different images for our building here, and I'll meet you back in a second. All right, so now we're here in Photoshop, and you don't have to use Photoshop. You can use any image editor that you prefer, but I prefer Photoshop, so that's what we're going to stick with for the series. But as you can see here, we've got the bitumen, and I've also got the glass that we'll be using for the walls. Now, like I said, it's very important that we stick to Explain's rules as far as these textures go. So if we inspect the image size here, you can see that the image is 512 pixels wide and 1024 pixels tall, and both of those are power of 2 values, so we are perfectly valid. Now, the way that I try and place these is if it's something that is going to tile in one way or the other, so it's something that's going to be repetitive, things like walls, for instance, that wrap around an entire building, one of the things that we want to do is we want to make sure that that image, or rather that material, stretches from one side of the image to the other side of the image in whatever axes it is you're stretching it. So we're going to be stretching this wall from left to right, so we want to make sure that the glass material in our texture image here actually goes from the left side of the image to the right side of the image like we have it here. Now the bitumen does the same thing, and generally speaking, most of the materials when you're working on fairly simple object models in SketchUp, you'll want them to go from one side of the image to the other. Another thing you might notice is that we have a little bit of space here at the bottom. Now I could fill this space up, but I'm choosing to do this on purpose. And the reason is because that when you're first starting out with SketchUp and texturing, a lot of people tend to forget something that they might need later. For instance, we don't have a door. There's no door here. And the problem arises where if, for instance, this was filled up completely, now if we want to go try and add a door to this texture, there's nowhere to put it, right? And I'll kind of discuss a little bit later on when we start applying this texture to the object, why that could be an issue, and we can't just, switch things around and move things around and make that space. Now that I'm somewhat satisfied with our texture image here, what we're going to do is we're going to save it, and we're going to save this image as a PNG file, and we are going to save it to the same directory as our building object. And I've named the building object building.skp, so I'll pull that up real fast. You can see here's our building file that we were working on in SketchUp. And so I prefer to keep the texture name the same as the object name when I'm doing these file names. And it's not required by any means, but it certainly makes things more easy later on. Another thing that we do need to note is that we can't use any strange characters. So we can't name it, building dash hyphen asterisk 129 or something like that. Try and stick to just simple alphanumeric characters, no spaces, anything like that. So we'll go ahead and save it here. And we'll look and we'll see now that we have the PNG as well as our SketchUp file. So we're good to go to start actually bringing this texture file into SketchUp and applying it to our object. Okay, now we're back here in SketchUp, and there's a materials pane over here on the right side. If you don't have that, you can simply go to Window, Default Tray, and click on Materials, and it should show up. Now what shows up initially is all these different SketchUp default materials. We can't use any of these because, like I said earlier, you can't use multiple images, and that's essentially how SketchUp is doing this. So what we want to do is we want to click this little drop down right here, and we'll go up to In Model, and this will show us everything that's currently used in the model. Now when you first do this, there might be some other color swatches in here. You can ignore those, but let's go ahead and import our custom texture image file by clicking on this Create Material button. We'll go down to the texture and we will browse to find our material image file. And we'll go and we'll find that PNG. We'll press open. And you'll see now that it's pulled it in, and we will press OK. And we now have our material file here in SketchUp. And we can actually start using this to paint our object. So we're going to take a closer look at this wall here. This will be the first one that we actually apply our texture to. Now to do that, we just go over here and click on the material in our materials pane. And you'll see that now we have this little paint bucket icon. Now another way of getting that is you go to Tools and you select the paint bucket option, or you can click the B as in Bravo key, and that's the shortcut to pull up this paint bucket. All we have to do to apply the texture is simply click on the face that we want to texture. But you'll notice that we have a slight problem here. The problem being that it's obviously a bit too small. So what we need to do is we need to scale up this image. How do we do that? Simple. Right click on the face that we just textured, go to the texture option and click position. Now you'll see that we have these 4 little pins here, and each of them have icons next to them and are colored differently, showing that they have some functionality built in. And you also have a tooltip that'll tell you exactly what each one does. But for instance, the red moves the texture around, the green scales the texture, and the yellow will skew the texture, as will the blue. So how do we use these tools to get our position correct for the texture on the face? Well, the first thing that we need to do is we need to tell SketchUp that we only need a portion of this. We don't need the bitumen in the texture area for this wall, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to click on this red pen, just one click with the left mouse button, and I can now move this pen wherever I need to, so I can set the boundary. Now, these pens are a little finicky and they're hard to deal with sometimes, but fortunately there is snapping. They snap to corners, they snap along the edge here of the image that we're using, and they also snap to the midpoint. And because the glass is exactly half the height of this image, that's where our midpoint is. So we're just going to click and move these pins into place, and we're now saying that we only need the area in between these 4 pins, which is simply just the glass area that we have. At this point, we can now begin to use the green, and we can click and we'll drag it. And just like the pins originally, there is snapping. So here I'm a little off, but it'll snap back into that 90-degree angle. So we'll drag it out and we'll scale it up a little bit. Now we'll zoom out and we will take the red and we'll use it to drag it down into this corner here. We will again use the green and pull it out until our texture covers the entire face. And there we go. Now there is another way of doing this. One of the things that we can do is we can right click and go back to our position, and there's an alternate way of using these pins. The way to do that is if you hold the shift key, you'll see that those little helper functions are no longer there. And what that allows us to do is we can actually move things independent of one another. So we can switch the location for all of these different pins. It can get you into trouble though. So one thing that you need to do, and I always make sure I do this, is if you pull one pin out, let's say we're going to pull this one to the right, then we have to pull its pair, its twin essentially, out to the right as well and match it up using those guides. Now why do we do that? Because if I come down here with this, you'll see now that our image is badly skewed and it's no longer square with the face of the building. So if we always make sure that we only go in one direction at a time, so we'll go down with this one and then we'll pull the other one down, you'll see it snaps into a square. We can make sure that we always keep the texture aligned with the face that we're working on. Now, if you have a rectangular face like we do here, this wall, it doesn't really matter. I can kind of pull these wherever I want and get them all sorts of out of whack, but because we're going to a rectangle in the end, all I have to do is pull these pins to the corner and they'll go back into alignment. Now, obviously in this situation, we've sort of lost, I guess you would say, our aspect ratio, right? These windows are incredibly wide, so we would then have to pull these pins back and make it a bit more narrow, still probably a little bit more. And now you'll see the windows are sort of matching up, and they might even still be a bit too wide. And this is why I usually use the helper pins, because it keeps everything nice and in the same aspect ratio as you had. So we'll go and click enter, and there we go. We've got one wall done. Now, how do we do the other walls? Tiling textures is actually quite simple if you set up your texture image file properly. Now, if you recall, when we did our image file here in Photoshop, we made sure that the glass texture went all the way from the left all the way to the right. And the reason that's important is if I go back here and go back into our position, you'll see that this actually scales horizontally. So in between these pins is one version of our image, and it's going to keep repeating along that horizontal axis. Well, that also means that it's going to repeat along this direction and every other direction as well, as long as it's the same height of this wall. So all we have to do is we'll go back to our paint bucket tool with the B key, and if we hold the Alt button, we get the eyedropper, which is for sampling. So this means that it's going to sample the textures that we've applied here, including with the pins and everything else, and we can use that later. So we'll click, and we'll go now have our paint bucket back. And if I click on this wall over here, you'll see that it's kept everything the exact same, and it's just started wrapping this around. And we'll click there, and we'll do all these other walls as well. And now all of a sudden, our entire building, all the glass is in place and textured. Now that we're done with the walls, let's go ahead and move on to the roof. So there is a couple ways of doing that. We can, of course, select the material again and apply it, but we will have to go through the same process of selecting the area that we want and resizing. Or we can sample over here and paste again. Now, we still have an issue here, but at least we don't have to go through as much scaling and we don't have to zoom in so far. So we'll start here and we will right click and we'll say texture position again. Well, I think the first thing that's quite obvious is we need to rotate this. So if you right click, go to rotate and click 90, now you'll see that we actually have this in the right orientation. What we want to do though is we do need to sort of redefine these pin locations. So we're going to move this over here to the midpoint. We'll move this one to the midpoint as well. Now this is where it gets a little tricky because there's no snapping, so we're going to have to zoom in quite far. And we will plop our pin right there on that edge. And we will do the same for this one over here. Now all we have to do is move it into position and we will scale it appropriately. So we'll move it down just a little bit. And there we go. We'll click enter and we have one area of the roof done. You'll see that I've actually split this up into multiple stripes. That's because, well, the way that we have the bitumen texture, it's not going to be wide enough for the entire roof to kind of keep that level of detail that we want. So I've split it into these smaller strips, and we'll just repeat it over and over, and that gives us a higher level of detail so that you can actually see a bit more of the material detail in there. Now, okay, what do we do for these other strips? Well, I could sample and start pasting, but you'll see that there's an issue here. If I right click in texture, you'll see that what it's actually doing is it's going down the texture file and it's applying it successively. Well, that's not what we want. So we'll go ahead and undo this. And there's a couple other ways of doing it. We can click this one and paste it in there, and we'll go position and we can drag it into place, right? But that doesn't really work out very well because, for instance, you might have areas where there's this line here that you're trying to line up, and now you're sort of off kilter a bit. So that's not fantastic. So we'll undo that real fast. And what we'll do is we'll try it a different way. We'll go back here, and you can hold the Shift key, and you can use your arrow keys to make these jumps. And so you can move it into place like this. And if you really want to get some fine granular control, for instance, here it's a little bit too far over. If you let go of the Shift key and use your arrows, it's smaller jumps. So that's all we have to do to just nudge it into place, and there we go. Of course, there's an even simpler way. What we can do is we can select the face, and we'll use our Move tool, which is right here, or you can click the M as in Mic key. And if you hold Control and click, you actually duplicate the face. So we'll just pop that into place right there. And now we can simply keep doing that all the way down the line. So we'll click, use the Move tool, hold Control for copy, pop it into place, and we'll do it all the way across. Now that's great, but well, what are we going to do here? Well, if you recall, these textures tile along this horizontal plane. So all I have to do is use the sample again for the paint bucket, sample this, paste it over here, and now I can even get rid of this little line that we created. And I'll do the same one more time. And there you go. Most of our roof is textured at this point. Now, there are some areas over here, but again, if you look, they are aligned with this face right here. So we'll sample, paste, and the same for this one over here, sample and paste. And there we go. Most of our roof is done at this point. For this one, we'll probably just go ahead and nudge it over a bit. And there we go. Our roof is done. So fairly quickly, you see that you can texture an entire building in SketchUp. It's actually not that difficult, but there are some things to be aware of. So let's talk about those. Now, one problem that people sometimes run into is they run afoul of that X-plane rule that says you can only use one texture image. So to talk about this, I've gone ahead and sort of recreated that situation where I created two additional versions of our texture image, and I've actually used one to apply to one of the faces. So if you ever see various versions of your texture file here in the end model section of the materials pane, unfortunately you're going to have to get rid of them. The way you do that is you right click on the material and click on delete. And if you've used one, which I have here, it'll give you a warning saying that it's being used. So you click OK, and you'll see that we've now lost that material in our object. So we'll simply just go through and reapply from our primary texture image. Another thing I mentioned earlier that could be problematic is if we don't leave some space in our image down here at the bottom, and for whatever reason, later on we have to go and increase the size, the dimensions of our image, it could be problematic. So we'll kind of review that now. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the size of this image to be 2048 tall instead of 1024 tall. So we're going to go up to the next power of 2 available, and we're going to save this image and just overwrite what we currently had. And what we'll do is we'll go back into SketchUp and see how that changes things. All right, so we're back in SketchUp now, and as you can see, everything is off now. So if we go in and we look at the texture position, you can see that all sorts of stuff got screwed up, and that's because when we re-import the image with the new dimensions, the pins reset themselves. And so you can tell that if you'd already gone through and textured this entire building, and then at the very end thought, oh no, I forgot a door texture or a window texture or something like that. It's clearly going to be a lot of work, and you're going to have to go through and re-texture everything. So that's why I always emphasize it, especially when you're starting out and you're just doing texturing in SketchUp for the first time. You really should give yourself some room at the bottom of your Photoshop file or whatever it is you're using, so that you have some leeway if you need to add stuff later on. Another common situation is that you've either renamed your texture image file or you have made some changes to your image file that you need to pull in. So to do that, you simply click on your image down here in the materials, and you go to the edit pane, and you'll see that we can actually go back through and we can once again browse for our material image file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Photoshop real fast. I'm going to just put a big white circle over everything, and we'll go back into SketchUp and we'll look at how it is that we re-import this image. Okay, so now that we're back in SketchUp, we'll go over to this Browse button, and we will select our new texture file. Again, that could be because we either renamed it or we added or changed something in the texture. We'll click Open, and you'll see that it is now applied. All these changes are applied to the model. If we go to the Select tab over here in our Materials pane, you'll see that the texture image is updated here as well. Obviously, we don't want to keep this for our next step, so we're going to get rid of it as we begin to export this for Xplane. Now that we're done modeling the object and texturing the object, it's time to export it for Xplane. So how do we do that? Well, we use Jonathan Harris's SketchUp to Xplane plugin. Some people might know him as Marginal. I will leave a link in the description to his website. But after you've downloaded and installed that, it's fairly trivial. All we have to do is we go to File, and we go to the Export Xplane Object option. Now, we're going to get a couple pieces of information here. The first is that it wrote 170 triangles to the object. For a building of this size and complexity, that seems about right, somewhere in the 200 range. Now, these triangles are essentially how many faces the Xplane is going to have to render. So if this said something like 10,000 triangles for this building, at that point I might be concerned that Xplane is going to have to be doing a whole lot of work to render this building that it shouldn't necessarily be needing to do. After you get more experience with Xplane scenery development design, you'll start to understand what sort of triangle count makes sense for whatever type of building it is you're doing. More complex buildings, buildings with rounded faces and things like that will of course have higher triangles than a simple building like we're doing now. The other piece of information here is that we have a warning that 49 faces are untextured. I can tell you what those are. It's these walls right here along the roof. We never actually went in and textured them. And SketchUp to Xplane has a handy little feature to help you find out where those faces are. It's asking, do we want to highlight those untextured faces? So we'll select yes. You'll see now that all those faces are colored red, and we've also got this red color over here in our end model. We also have a clear one for the backside of any faces, but we don't need to worry about that right now. This is especially handy when, for instance, you're doing a all-white object, something like perhaps a water tower that is actually textured white, and it's hard to tell exactly which faces you've already painted white and which ones are just the default SketchUp white. But for our use right now, it's just highlighting where we forgot to do stuff. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to start texturing these faces in, and I'll be back in just a moment. Now that I've gone through and gotten rid of all those bright red faces and replaced them with actual textures, we can now go into our end model, and if we want, we can right click, and again, we can delete these textures, make sure that they're not used anywhere. And we'll at this time go ahead and go back to File, Export Xplane Object, and we'll see if we get that error, and we don't anymore. So now all it's saying is we wrote the triangles, no more errors about untextured faces, so we'll click OK. And if we go and we look in our folder, you'll see that we now have building SKP has created building.obj. At this point, we can now go into World Editor for Xplane and start placing this object into our scenery package, which we will do in the next video. I hope you enjoyed today's quick tutorial, and I also hope that you'll follow along the series as we get through other aspects of Xplane scenery development. In the meantime, please check out my twitch.tv channel, come, hang out, say hello, and watch and learn as I develop other custom sceneries for X-Plane. I'm always more than happy to talk to anybody about these topics and answer any questions you might have. Until next time, I'm Matt Congrove. Thank you for watching.